When you lose your mind because of a mental illness and addiction, you lose who you are. And it's a much deeper wound than just the
Yeah,
physical challenge of maybe losing your life because of an overdose or suicide. You've lost who you are. That means that when you save
that's
someone,
right.
you're saving who they are as a person, their personhood. I don't know, but there's something spiritual in that.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Taylor Justice,
And I'm Esther Farkas.
and today we have Patrick Kennedy. I'm super excited to have him on the podcast. Not just because I bought 10 copies of his book, Common Struggle, but he is a mental health advocate. And in his time and in his political career, fought for and advocated for those with mental illness, substance use, and other factors, which we're going to dig into here in depth.
Yeah, and I'm excited to talk to you and hear a little bit about how you think about the mental health crisis today. You've been involved in the area for a number of years now. You were instrumental in passing federal legislation that addressed it. How has it changed, and where are we now in the struggle? Because it's still ongoing, and there are still big problems to solve. So excited to hear your take on that.
So, Patrick, welcome to What Unites Us.
Thank you so much, Taylor, and thank you, Esther, for welcoming me to your program.
Absolutely. So let's fast forward a little bit into your political career, and maybe set the stage a little bit on why is this so important to you, and what have you been up to post public service?
Well, I never intended to be a leader in mental health. In fact, that would be the furthest thing from what I wanted to be when I went into politics. I kind of ended up with the mantle of leadership because, first of all, I was outed by the fellow that I was in drug rehab with at 17, who sold his story about being in drug rehab with Patrick Kennedy, and it was on the front page of the National Enquirer with him and his picture telling about how he was in rehab with me. And that was early in my political career, but I thought that would be the end of my political career. What ended up happening was something completely different. My constituency in Providence, Rhode Island, they don't like drug addicts, but they don't like people who rat on drug addicts, most of all. So I
Yeah.
ended up getting reelected because no one wanted to look like they were siding with those that were attacking me because it was based upon this guy who had ratted me out, so to speak. My life changed after that because I wasn't as guarding a secret anymore, if you will, which is what really marks these illnesses is the shame and stigma and the fact that we want to
Hmm.
keep these things secret, even though we're the last ones to realize that everyone else knows the secret except for us. And when I went to Washington, I didn't have to worry about people finding out because they already knew. And so I was really liberated in my ability to be the sponsor of the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act. But it says a lot about stigma back in the 90s because I was the youngest member of Congress from the smallest state in the country in Rhode Island. And I was in the minority party at that time because Newt Gingrich had taken the House and his speakership. And yet I got to put my name first on a bill
Hmm.
that required insurance companies to pay for mental health and addiction care no more restrictively than they would pay for any other chronic illness like cardiovascular disease or diabetes or cancer. So it really was a blessing that this guy ratted on me because most of my colleagues would not have signed on to that bill as the first
Yeah.
signature because they would worry that the press would ask them, do they have a mental illness or addiction, or does anyone in their family? And of course, most politicians don't want to go down that rabbit hole because it's fraught with
Yeah,
political peril, like what medications,
Totally.
what was your rehab
yeah.
like, blah, blah, blah. But thankfully, that stuff was out. So I got to do this bill, and you would have thought it would have been a popular bill for everyone to sign on, but it says a lot that stigma meant that the guy that was lowest on the totem pole Really, is because seniority matters, not just in
Yeah.
business and in the military, but it matters in politics. And if usually it's the most senior members who get to put their name first on any really popular bill. But just to show you how unpopular mental health was back in the 90s, I got to be the sponsor, which tells you a lot that you got me today kind of by default. I
Yeah.
suppose if it had been a more popular issue, you'd be having someone else on your podcast to
Yeah.
talk about their
Well,
leadership.
Actually, before we get into some of the political and policy movements, I think it's pretty important to kind of talk about like the personal toll. I
yeah.
mean, I think from your standpoint, you come from a family that is highly visible to the public. And so maybe it was easier for you being able to handle a lot of these different things. But at the end of the day, one, being outed, not knowing what that was going or how that was going to impact you. Can you talk just a little bit about the personal side of both that experience while you're also dealing with something that you don't want anybody else to know about? Because you talked about it's the secret. I think at times we gloss over like that personal courage, or there's something that has to happen where there's this weight lifted off your shoulder, and then you're able to actually not only persevere individually, but actually turn that into positive energy like you did, to put this at the forefront.
Right. Well, I grew up in an alcoholic family. My mother suffered terribly from alcoholism and severe depression, and her mother died at 61 and wasn't found for a couple of weeks because she lived alone and she was so isolated. And she divorced my grandfather back in the 1950s, which was unheard of for Catholics,
Yeah.
especially. It tells you a lot about these illnesses. We want to isolate. We don't want to be around anyone, and frankly, no one wants to be around us. It's kind of mutually assured destruction. So I grew up, hiding my mother as much as I could from my friends and their mothers when they would come over and pick up my friends from our house. I'd try to make sure they never met my mother because my mother was ordinarily intoxicated, and my dad suffered a lot, both from trauma. Before Taylor, your generation kind of made trauma a household word because of your service to our country, and thank you for that. My dad was, if you would, a picture of post-traumatic stress, having seen many of his family members killed and
Hmm.
assassinated, and the trauma he lived through, and he self-medicated with alcohol as well. And so I knew this was something that was important in my family, although I didn't put it in the category of some bigger mission. As I said, I didn't
Yeah.
intend to get into politics to advance mental health. And by accident, when this thing happened to me, I got a lot of reinforcement from people that I didn't know who started opening up to me because I was someone that they knew who shared their experience. So in
Yeah.
politics, I
Mm-hmm.
was blessed because people came out from the shadows and told me about their own, and that reinforced this idea that maybe there's a road for me to do something akin to what my family had done in civil rights and in the labor movement and in workers' rights and so forth, the gay rights movement, all of which my family was really kind of on the forefront of. But of
Yeah.
course, we never saw this as something akin to those other movements for social justice.
Mm-hmm.
And honestly, Taylor, when I was growing up and I saw pictures of my Uncle Bobby with Dr. King or President Kennedy giving the seminal address on civil rights as the first president to talk about that issue as a moral issue, like I thought to myself, well, that's what I want to do. And I
Hmm.
never framed how people with these illnesses were also discriminated against. And in a very similar way, were also marginalized. And and really, it was something that happened to me over time, but mostly because people were very affirming to me when I got outed, and that
Mm-hmm.
made me not want to run away from it like I had before, but rather feel
Yeah.
like this may be a message from God that this is kind of what I'm supposed to and what I'm meant to do.
So you talked a lot about secrets. You talked a lot about other people giving you the courage, or as you started to engage or learn more about your family, that it wasn't actually a secret, but other people reaching out to you, dealing with similar issues. Then kind of going into, hey, let's not just jump in once it's already so far gone. How do we get ahead of some of these issues? And there are different influencers and individuals or organizations that can help. How does that tie into your view from a policy perspective of how multiple organizations need to better communicate and share information? Because I know you're a big advocate against, policies around like 42 CFR
Yes.
Part 2. And the need to really have that open communication. Can you just dig in a little bit on what is 42 CFR Part 2? Why do you think there are limitations to actually helping people receive the care that they need to overcome some of these challenges? And what role does coordination and working with other counterparts play in ultimately trying to be upstream, be proactive in this engagement? Because I think we've kind of talked around it a little bit, but it's, I think, clicked for me, whereas now you're going with this policy, how that's so important, where if someone's mentioning, hey, I've got X, Y, or Z issue, or I'm dealing with this, that's an opportunity to inject yourself. But then more and more people start to help that person, that weight comes off their shoulders quicker. And if you can do that earlier in the process, it's better. So talk to me a little bit about the 42 CFR, what its intent was, why it's missing the mark, and where you think it should go, and people collaborating and exchanging information around individuals they're trying to support and help.
Well, there's a phrase that something runs in the family. Like for me, addiction galloped in my family. And
Mm-hmm.
in the future, I want my kids, who I know, because these are the most heritable illnesses, they're the most genetically based. Most people don't know that. I was on the NIH Appropriations Committee and took particular interest in the National Institutes of Mental Health, National Institutes on Alcoholism and Drug Addiction. So I know a little bit about this. And my thought is that anyone treating me in the future who knew the family that I came from never would have prescribed Oxycontin the way they did, never would have
Yeah.
prescribed
Yeah.
benzodiazepines the way they did, never would have done these things. I actually would have been really had a very strong regimen. And by the way, I'm an asthmatic too, and I have a lot that I do to make sure my environment is free of triggers, drapes, plants. I really try to restrict the things that spark kind of asthma attacks. I certainly don't hang around animals. And, I just have a whole protocol. I take my medicines before I exercise. And what I want is the same approach for mental health and addiction. So in the future, we wouldn't wait for me, who was totally an addict waiting to happen, to have full-blown addiction and run the consequences of that later in life when it could have been caught and even identified, and I could have been part of a risk stratification, much like they ask, is there a history of cancer in your family and cardiovascular disease? Because they want to know what your risk profile is to know how to best tailor your approach to healthcare. That ought to be the same in mental health. So fast forward, I am someone who's gotten a lot of headlines for DWIs and repeated hospitalizations. There's lots of articles written about me. I even self-disclosed to my new doctor after I left Congress that I'm in recovery from addiction. And in spite of that, when I injured my hand and needed stitches, first thing they wanted to do is prescribe me Percocet. When I told them, even when I during my intake, when they asked me, what are you allergic to? I said penicillin and opioids. And the nurse had never heard that before. She said, opioids, I've never heard that. And that's a
Wow.
problem in our system because we don't have literacy amongst our medical community about how deadly addiction is. So I've been taking Lipitor for my grandfather has stroke. I have high cholesterol. I'll die from cholesterol if I don't treat it now. I've been on Lipitor for 15 years because the medical system wants to save my life when I'm in my 60s from a
Mm-hmm.
stroke or a heart attack. Where is that same interest in saving my life from addiction, which poses an even more existential threat to me in taking my life either from addiction or depression? So we really do not have a system geared towards treating these illnesses. And that's what infuriates me. And the 42 CFR that you asked about is a perfect example of where stigma has still reigned in our medical system, where we silo treatment from addiction.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if I were unconscious and was reeled into the ER back when I was on Vivitrol, for example, for my alcoholism and my opioid addiction, but we know naltrexone and is really for most beneficial to alcoholism. And that was not on my EMR, Taylor,
Yeah.
because of 42 CFR. And they
Mm-hmm.
gave me opioids. They could have killed me.
Yeah.
So my point, Taylor, is there is medical malpractice. If we can put whether you have an STD, if we can put whether you have all these other things, erectile dysfunction on your medical record. I mean,
Whoa,
come on.
Patrick. I mean, come on. Don't.
Why
Come on.
would you be afraid? I mean, I know stigma still reigns, but I mean, we're only going to have our lives saved if we banish this idea that we
Yeah.
have to somehow hide this, because that's going to be our undoing.
But this is a very heated topic because you look at the other side. There's others that are about privacy and restrictions on information sharing. Some call it data blocking. Others are, we want to protect the individual in need because, there are, bad actors in every part of society that, kind of ruin the intent of supporting folks. So when you have individuals or political wins or lobbyists that are trying to restrict information, what's that fight look like? And so I see both sides, but ultimately the world tries to operate in a binary setting, yes or no. What's the compromise for those that really want to have restrictions on information sharing, and others that are it's like it makes common sense that if someone is dealing with mental health issues or substance use or even tactical things around social determinants of health of I need a roof over my head, I need food in my belly, I need access to a career. People even want to limit sharing of information there of stepping people out of government assistance. So what's the compromise for these two sides?
Well, first
Yeah,
of
and
all,
can I?
as you point out, there's very good reason for people to have erected 42 CFR at the beginning. I mean, literally,
Yeah.
you had the
Yeah.
Drug Enforcement Agency looking up who is being treated for heroin addiction and using those people as their target list for whose door they broke down and arrested.
Yeah.
I mean, we have to keep
Yeah.
in mind that there are very real reasons why we had to be especially careful on, especially with addiction, having our records known. But as you know, we also passed healthcare information protection Privacy Act, HIPAA,
Mm-hmm.
which, by the
Mm-hmm.
way, protects anyone from finding out that we have a terminal illness, we have HIV, we have an STD, or whatever. So there's lots of information. And by the way, you can work out your private health information. There are ways that, in communication with your physician, you can really have a say in what your personal health information looks like. But as far as treating you in the optimal way that will protect you from losing your life, there's certain critical information like what medications am I on? If you don't know what those medications are, we know that people get killed all the time because of the conflicting efforts of prescribing one drug that is conflicts with another drug and could prove fatal, as I pointed out in the earlier example. So I really think that, if we're really concerned with privacy, we got to do something about our social media platforms.
Mm-hmm.
That's really where our challenge is. I think that is public health challenge
That
of
is
one of the
such a
first
good
orders.
call out. That is such a good call out because I think it gets confused at times. And so, yes, there is a big push against big tech, predominantly on the social side of things. When you think of the big tech companies and all the information that they have on individuals, sometimes that can get conflated when you're actually trying to provide hardcore services to those in need.
That's right.
And so you just think of tech as like, oh, well, this rides across technology. They're the same as Facebook or Google
Right.
or these other, and it's not the case. I think Esther and I on this side of the podcast are in full alignment with your view on the need for more coordination to support in these critical areas, but for the sake of not getting beat up after this podcast, I'm going to let Esther jump in here with a question that I think she has for you.
Well, I mean, look, I think I'm a lawyer by training, so I'm always thinking about the other side of everything. And I think, the other side of this is certainly the stigma that you touched on that comes with addiction. And that also hits different folks at different places differently. So that means that, of course, some things were much harder for you because of your family, because of your public position, because of the expectations that you had. But they were, of course, easier as well because of who you are, because of, some of the privileges that you grew up with. And so I know you think about this, but how do you think about sort of that stigma that is still very much there and hits different folks differently if you're living in a different neighborhood, if your skin is a different color, if you have a different background? Of course, you're always thinking about addiction as a very, very serious weakness, and in some cases, an expectation of you by society. And so you don't have it's a bigger stigma, just to say it, than it is for somebody who has this, to a certain extent, the support system and the things that you had in life. So how do we tackle that? How do we tackle how this stigma hits different people differently?
It's interesting that, as I said, stigma reigns so supreme when we know if we were to intervene earlier, there wouldn't be stigma. And the reason why there wouldn't be stigma is people would be in recovery and they would see the strength of these positives of mental health. The reason there's stigma is we don't treat people until they're at death's door. And all of our experience with the people that we
Yeah.
love and we live with or we work with who've had these illnesses are at death's door. And by the way, they don't get better mostly because just like if we treated them when they're
Yeah.
stage 4 cancer, they often don't get better. But if we reached in earlier
Yeah.
and didn't wait for it to become a diagnosis, I guarantee you we could stave off a lot of illnesses pathologizing, even schizophrenia. If we treated bipolar and schizophrenia first incidence of psychosis, we can permanently change the trajectory of people's disability because the brain doesn't have a time to pathologize and spin out, literally, in the brain, which creates greater disability. And then, of course, people need more medication if they've got greater damage, which means they feel the side effects, which means they don't want to take that medication, which means now they're homeless and they're in crisis or they're locked up in jail. So these things all connect. And, this is an exciting time, but we have to go upstream. And that will help change these attitudes so that people will not look at mental health in such a stigmatized way.
Yeah,
What?
and so to
Yeah.
to kind of follow on to Esther's question there, and to kind of talk about what you're still doing, right? You're still out there fighting. You're still out there doing a lot of great work in the Atlanta market with the center there. Can talk a little bit about the groups you're involved with, the work that they're doing, and what's next on the horizon. What's maybe not the next big fight or the big policy push. But what are some of the big trends you're seeing based on the all of the organizations you both helped fund and start, but also the other alliances
Well,
that you're a part
when
of.
I was growing up, we, in my family, I was particularly worried that my dad was going to get shot as well. And we had bulletproof vests in all of our closets. And I was terrified when he was out there. And, he had Secret Service, but we all knew that wasn't going to be enough, even though we love Secret Service and they do so much to protect.
Well, hold on. Can we just go into that just to quickly? I mean, I'm sorry to cut you off, but growing up as a child, having to wear bulletproof vests, obviously seeing the assassination of family members, worrying about your father, being that young, and having to have all that pressure on you, and also then still be in the public eye. Can we just go a little bit deeper into what that was?
Well, I was actually talking about that more in the context of why I'm a big supporter of Black mental health and cultural competency, because that's why I started this Kennedy Satcher Center at Morehouse School of Medicine, because I know the mental health treatment community does not look like America. They're mostly white. There's not enough
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Black therapists and other therapists of color. And if we're going to address post George Floyd, that is a systemic issue. You need to be mindful of it. And I knew David Satcher from my
Mm-hmm.
work. He's a champion of this cause, and he's taught me a lot. And that's why I did the Kennedy Satcher Center at Morehouse School of Medicine. But I worked on One Mind because I love neuroscience, and we not only have to improve the
Yeah.
treatment, which I want to thank Unite Us for integrating social determinants, housing, vocational supports, social supports into mental health. Because if you're just getting the medication and the therapy, if you don't have a stable place to live and you're subjected to really adverse experiences in your real life that aren't addressed, you're never going to get better. So thank you for what you do to help piece together this broken system. But my goal is to try to build all the different pieces of this puzzle. And, the neuroscience piece, we do need to get better, both research based science, which is how do we practically implement better systems of care that will give people better outcomes, but also how do we understand
Hmm.
our brain more effectively? What do we need to do to improve our understanding of the brain? So I'm also fascinated by research in the neurosciences, and that's why One Mind for research has been something I've really liked to work on, as well as the Kennedy Satcher Center at Morehouse.
Yeah, I'm so impressed hearing you speak about your advocacy work, and your family has such a heritage of advocacy, and I think at such scale, which is incredible. And obviously you found your voice, and it's quite strong, and in that lineage. But what advice do you have for people on trying to find their voice and trying to find that thing that they want to advocate for, that they believe in life, that they want to improve their small or larger world with
Well,
around
I'm
them?
blessed to be in recovery, which means I have a sense of a greater purpose in life, because God works through people, and in my home group and my peers in 12-step recovery, I feel a sense of connectedness, belonging, and purpose. And people can channel that any which way they want, but that idea of people and purpose and place, which first John Sharon talked about
Hmm.
in Los Angeles. He was a psychiatrist in the VA out there on the West VA campus, but he also ran LA County mental health, and he's a super, super guy who's been a friend of mine. I'm proud to say that. But, my sense is that we have to find within ourselves kind of what moves us, and then once you do,
Hmm.
you can choose the level you want to move at. I was blessed because I had, dinner with, presidents and cabinet officials, and I got to walk on the floor of the Senate, as a fellow member of Congress when my dad was there. I was part of all of these big things. Harry Belafonte was at our house, and Rayford Johnson, and Rosie Greer, and John Glenn, and Jim Whitaker scaled, Mount Everest, first American. My point is that, like, I saw the world in a much bigger way because my family was part of big things. So I may sound like I'm way over my skis and thinking about the world in a much bigger way, but it's only because that's what I can do. And and I believe we can all do our part. And for me, I've been given more to be able to do with. So I have a greater obligation, if you will, to do more because, frankly, not because of me. I have this great last name that opens doors and gives me a chance to do things. I joke to people I didn't get elected at 27 and then get elected to the fourth position in leadership at 31 in the House because of my good looks and personality. I know, what what what
I
punched my
disagree.
ticket.
I
I
disagree
had
with that.
a great name, and that facilitated a lot. So, but there people in my life in recovery are saving lives every day, and I am inspired by them.
Yeah.
And so there's all kinds of ways we help each other. And the most meaningful ways are not, frankly, doing this policy stuff. The most meaningful ways are helping family members get treatment because I know how to get them treatment. Helping my neighbors here in Brigantine, New Jersey, get help for their children because they know I'm who I am in terms of my mental health, and they know they can ask me for
Yeah.
help. And I frankly think
Right.
mental health, it could be a great unifier because it touches everybody. And it's such a threat, not just to our
That's right.
physical health, but to our who we are as people. So when you lose your mind because of a mental illness and addiction, you lose who you are. And it's a much deeper wound than just the
Yeah.
physical challenge of maybe losing your life because of an overdose or suicide. You've lost who you are. That means that when you save
That's
someone,
right.
you're saving who they are as a person, their personhood. I don't know, but there's something spiritual in that supersedes what you see in the rest of medical care. And God bless all the people in the rest of medicine for
Right.
saving our lives. But it's hard for me to understand how we disregard these illnesses because they literally rob us of our loved ones.
I'm going to ask you a question we just asked a previous guest, Seema Verma, and it's specific to healthcare. Is healthcare too big to fix, and you need some big disastrous event to really kind of start over from scratch, or is there a path forward?
Well, it's a
And if
public
so, what is
health
it?
model. As I said, we don't have enough clinicians or resources to treat our way out of this. And we know that with less than
Yeah.
20% of the population consuming over 80% of the healthcare dollars, largely driven by chronic illnesses that are dramatically exacerbated by a mental health underlying condition, which we don't treat, we don't identify, and even if we did, we don't integrate into the rest of care. So there is a way to reduce total cost of care, and there is a way to reduce the burden of illness so that the system will not crash because of cost. And that system is getting in early, having a public health model, educating people how to manage stress themselves, giving them the tools. That's what we're going to have to do. So, in a sense, Taylor, I think we do need to reboot the system because it can't just be a
Yeah.
medical model. By the time you get a diagnosis, I mean, we should be going like a pyramid. It's, people with severe and high diagnosis should be kind of at the top of the pyramid. We ought to be tracking on people who don't have a diagnosis, and we want to keep them from having diagnosis. And by the way, to your binary, it's like you're either got a diagnosis or you don't. That's something faulty too, because frankly,
Mm-hmm.
everybody
Yep.
has mental health challenges. And the only way we recognize it in society is, oh, do you have a diagnosis or don't you? No, that's not the way to look at this. We have to look at this much more as a public health challenge.
Well, Patrick Kennedy, I want to thank you very much for coming on What Unites Us, being open and vulnerable with your own story, and kind of expressing both the courage you took and how that was uplifted by others, and probably encouraging a few folks that were listening to kind of follow a very similar path. I think Esther and I have very similar views on the need to reboot the healthcare system to be more of a preventative model, and that goes across all things, not just again in the four walls of that clinical space. But really appreciate your time and your wisdom. Thank you for joining What Unites Us.